Willowbrook, Maine, nestled along the rugged coastline, was the epitome of small-town perfection. Its cobblestone streets were lined with colonial homes, and the townsfolk prided themselves on knowing one another. Among them, the Harper family stood as a beacon of stability and success. Dr. Jonathan Harper, 42, was the kind of man who commanded respect wherever he went. As a renowned cardiologist at Willowbrook General Hospital, his days were spent saving lives, while his evenings were reserved for charity events or quiet dinners with his wife. Jonathan's tall stature and calm demeanor made him the ideal image of a devoted husband. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a weariness he hid well, a pressure to maintain the perfect facade that the town demanded. His wife, Sophia Harper, was every bit his equal in charm and admiration. At 38, Sophia exuded a natural warmth that endeared her to everyone she met. As a third-grade teacher at the local elementary school, she was beloved by students and their parents alike. Her auburn hair and sparkling green eyes complemented her vivacious smile, making her the picture of contentment. Together, Jonathan and Sophia were the golden couple of Elm Street, their stately colonial home often the site of lively gatherings and fundraisers. But behind the manicured lawn and candlelit windows, the Harpers' marriage wasn't as unshakable as it seemed. Sophia had noticed subtle changes in Jonathan. He had become distant, retreating into long hours at the hospital and increasingly absent from their nightly walks. She tried to dismiss it as the weight of his demanding career, but the silence at the dinner table lingered like a shadow. When she brought up starting a family, a topic they had shelved for years, Jonathan's vague promises only deepened her unease. Sophia couldn't help but feel that there was something he wasn't telling her. One brisk September morning, their carefully curated life began to shift. Jonathan left early for his hospital rounds, his coffee untouched and his briefcase gripped tightly. He hardly noticed Sophia watching him from the kitchen window, her hand cradling a steaming mug. She sighed, brushing off the cold distance between them as temporary. "We'll fix this," she whispered to herself. "We always do." Later that afternoon, Sophia attended a fundraiser at the hospital. It was here she first met Dr. Lillian Chong, the town's newly arrived OB-GYN. Lillian was striking, her long black hair and tailored blazer set her apart from the other attendees. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she had seen much of the world before settling in Willowbrook. Sophia introduced herself, intrigued by the doctor's reserved demeanor. The two women struck up a friendly conversation about education and healthcare, and Sophia found herself immediately drawn to Lillian's thoughtful perspective. Jonathan, who had been mingling nearby, eventually joined them. He greeted Lillian politely, but something flickered in his eyes, an intrigue he hadn't felt in years. As the fundraiser continued, Sophia was unaware of the spark she had just ignited. Jonathan, usually composed, found himself glancing at Lillian across the room. Her intelligence and understated elegance pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. But it was just admiration, he told himself. Nothing more. Or so he thought. That evening, as the Harpers drove home under a canopy of autumn leaves, Sophia recounted her conversation with Lillian, praising the new doctor's professionalism. Jonathan nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Sophia mistook his silence for exhaustion, never realizing that her glowing words about Lillian had planted a seed that would soon upend their idyllic lives. Unbeknownst to either of them, the Harpers' perfect world had just begun to crack. And in the quiet, watchful town of Willowbrook, cracks rarely went unnoticed. The arrival of Dr. Lillian Chong in Willowbrook was met with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. The town's only gynecology practice had been struggling for years, and Lillian's impressive resume, degrees from Ivy League universities and years of experience in urban hospitals, seemed like a godsend. Her presence breathed new life into Willowbrook General Hospital, and patients flocked to her, grateful for her gentle demeanor and attentive care. Lillian, at 35, was as poised as she was reserved. Her striking features, long black hair, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold unspoken thoughts, and a natural elegance, set her apart in the cozy, unpretentious town. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world but chose to keep most of her experiences to herself. Few in Willowbrook knew of the past she had left behind, and that was exactly how Lillian wanted it. For Lillian, Willowbrook wasn't just a new start, it was a refuge. After enduring years of emotional manipulation and control from her ex-husband, Daniel Chang, she had finally broken free. The small town promised anonymity and simplicity, a stark contrast to the chaos of her previous life. Yet, no matter how far she ran, the ghosts of her past followed. Daniel's shadow loomed in her mind, his voice a faint echo she couldn't entirely escape. It was at a hospital fundraiser in late October that Lillian crossed paths with the Harpers again. The event was a grand affair, held in the hospital's ballroom, with tables adorned in autumnal hues of gold and burnt orange. Sophia was there to represent her school, and Jonathan had been invited as a key hospital donor. Lillian, in a navy sheath dress that exuded understated sophistication, kept to herself at first, preferring to observe from the periphery. Sophia, ever sociable, sought her out. "Dr. Chang. So good to see you again," she greeted warmly. "I've been telling everyone how lucky we are to have you in Willowbrook." Lillian smiled politely. "That's very kind of you. I'm still getting used to the pace here, it's so different from the city." "It is," Sophia agreed with a laugh. "But I think you'll find it grows on you." Jonathan joined them shortly after, offering Lillian a handshake. "Dr. Chang, welcome to Willowbrook. I've heard great things about your work." "Thank you, Dr. Harper," she replied, meeting his gaze. Their handshake lingered a moment too long, an exchange that neither acknowledged but both felt. The conversation meandered through polite topics, healthcare, the challenges of small-town medicine, but Jonathan found himself unusually captivated. Lillian's intelligence and subtle humor were a refreshing contrast to the predictable conversations he often had. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of intrigue. From across the room, Sophia watched the two of them with an unassuming smile, unaware of the undercurrent between her husband and her new friend. Later that evening, as they drove home, she couldn't stop singing Lillian's praises. "She's brilliant, John. I'm thinking of switching to her for my next checkup." Jonathan nodded, staring out at the road. "Sounds like a good idea," he muttered, his mind already replaying snippets of their conversation with Lillian. In the following weeks, Lillian's name began cropping up more frequently in their household. Sophia, having struck up a budding friendship with her, often mentioned their chats over coffee or Lillian's kind words about the community. Jonathan, though outwardly indifferent, absorbed every word. Then came the first unexpected encounter. Jonathan spotted Lillian in the hospital cafeteria one crisp November afternoon. She was sitting alone, her laptop open beside a salad she barely touched. Without thinking, he approached her table. "Mind if I join you?" Lillian looked up, startled but not displeased. "Not at all, Dr. Harper. Please, call me Jonathan." What started as a casual lunch quickly turned into an animated conversation. They discovered shared interests, a love for Bach's concertos, a mutual admiration for foreign cinema, and found themselves laughing more than either had in weeks. When the lunch hour ended, they parted ways, but Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For Lillian, the lunch was a rare moment of connection in her otherwise solitary existence. She told herself it was nothing more than professional camaraderie. Yet, deep down, she couldn't deny the warmth she felt in Jonathan's presence. Unbeknownst to either of them, their lives had begun to intertwine in ways that would soon spiral beyond their control. For now, the bond was fragile, like a thread pulled taut, but it was enough to start unraveling the delicate fabric of their perfect lives. November arrived in Willowbrook, bringing with it brisk winds that rustled the last of the autumn leaves. At Willowbrook General Hospital, the corridors buzzed with their usual urgency, but for Jonathan Harper, the days had taken on a different rhythm. He found himself looking forward to those fleeting moments when he might cross paths with Lillian Chang. A passing smile, a quick conversation in the elevator, or the occasional shared lunch in the cafeteria became the highlights of his day. For weeks, Jonathan convinced himself that his growing interest in Lillian was harmless. After all, what was a little admiration? He still returned home to Sophia, still went through the motions of their shared routines. Yet, he couldn't deny the spark he felt when he was around Lillian, a spark that had been absent from his life for far too long. Lillian, too, felt the pull. At first, she resisted, retreating into the professionalism that had served her so well in her career. But Jonathan had a way of breaking through her defenses. His conversations were engaging, his wit disarming. In him, she saw not just a respected colleague but a man searching for something she understood all too well. One evening, after an exhausting day at the hospital, Jonathan found himself in the doctor's lounge, his head buried in his hands. A surgery had gone wrong, a patient nearly lost on the operating table. The weight of the day pressed down on him like a vice. "Jonathan?" Lillian's voice broke through the silence. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "It's nothing," he muttered, though his voice betrayed the strain. Lillian stepped closer, her footsteps soft against the carpet. "You don't look like it's nothing." She sat beside him, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. "Talk to me." And he did. For the first time in years, Jonathan let down his guard, sharing the doubts and fears he kept hidden from everyone, even Sophia. Lillian listened, her dark eyes steady, her voice soothing when she spoke. In that moment, the line between friendship and something more blurred. When their eyes met, it was as though an unspoken agreement passed between them. Before either could stop themselves, their lips met in a kiss, a brief, trembling connection that left them both stunned. Jonathan pulled away almost immediately, muttering apologies, his mind reeling. Lillian, equally shaken, left the room without a word. The days that followed were fraught with tension. They avoided each other, each pretending the kiss had never happened. But the damage was done. A seed had been planted, and neither of them could ignore its growing presence. Jonathan's behavior at home became increasingly erratic. Sophia, ever perceptive, noticed the changes. He was more distracted, his laughter forced, his phone never far from his side. When she suggested a weekend getaway to rekindle their connection, he declined, citing work commitments. Sophia's attempts to bring them closer only seemed to widen the gap. She planned romantic dinners and bought a new dress she thought Jonathan would notice. But his eyes seemed to be elsewhere, somewhere she couldn't reach. Her frustration grew, though she tried to suppress it, convincing herself that the man she loved would eventually return to her. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Jonathan and Lillian couldn't resist the pull any longer. Their stolen moments became more frequent, quiet conversations in empty corridors, fleeting touches that sent shivers down their spines. Each encounter deepened the bond between them, turning what they once dismissed as a fleeting connection into something neither could deny. They began meeting in secret. At first, it was late-night walks through Birchwood Park, where the rustle of leaves provided cover for whispered words and stolen kisses. Then, as their desire grew, they sought out more private places, a secluded room at the hospital, a quaint bed and breakfast on the outskirts of Willowbrook. For Jonathan, these moments with Lillian were intoxicating, a reprieve from the pressures of his carefully curated life. But they also brought guilt. He loved Sophia, or at least, he thought he did. The betrayal ate at him, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop. Lillian wrestled with her own demons. She knew the affair was wrong, knew the hurt it would cause if discovered. But after years of feeling controlled and unloved in her marriage to Daniel, the attention and affection Jonathan offered felt like something she couldn't walk away from. Back at home, Sophia's suspicions deepened. She noticed Jonathan's late nights becoming more frequent, his excuses less convincing. She began piecing together the fragments: receipts for dinners she hadn't attended, the faint scent of a perfume that wasn't hers. But instead of confronting him, she waited, hoping for some sign that her fears were unfounded. As the Harper household grew colder, the passion between Jonathan and Lillian burned brighter. They were two people trying to fill voids in their lives, unaware that the path they had chosen would soon lead to consequences neither could escape. In the quiet, watchful town of Willowbrook, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. December settled over Willowbrook, blanketing the small town in frost and holiday cheer. Strings of twinkling lights lined the rooftops, and storefronts displayed wreaths and festive ornaments. Yet, inside the Harper household, the atmosphere was anything but warm. Sophia Harper clung to the hope that the holidays might bridge the widening chasm between her and Jonathan, but each passing day only deepened her suspicions. It was during one of her routine appointments at Willowbrook General Hospital that Sophia's life took an unexpected turn. She had scheduled a checkup with Dr. Lillian Chang, now her trusted physician and confidant. Sophia had been feeling fatigued and lightheaded, attributing it to the stress of her strained marriage. But as Lillian reviewed the results of her blood work, her expression shifted to something more serious. "Sophia," Lillian began, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "The results are in, and I have some news. You're pregnant." For a moment, time stood still. Sophia stared at Lillian, her mind racing to process the words. Pregnant. After years of putting off children due to Jonathan's career and their busy lives, the possibility had seemed distant, even improbable. But now, with the confirmation before her, she felt an unexpected surge of joy. "Oh my God," Sophia whispered, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. Tears welled in her eyes as a smile broke across her face. "I can't believe it." Lillian returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Congratulations," she said softly, but the weight in her chest grew heavier with every word. For Lillian, Sophia's pregnancy was more than just a routine announcement, it was a cruel twist of fate. She, too, had been grappling with symptoms she could no longer ignore. The morning sickness, the bouts of dizziness, the subtle but undeniable changes in her body. Just that morning, she had taken a home pregnancy test, and the two pink lines staring back at her had confirmed her fears. Now, standing before Sophia, she felt as though the walls of her carefully constructed life were closing in. That evening, Sophia returned home with renewed determination. She imagined the look of joy on Jonathan's face when she told him the news, the way their baby might finally bring them back together. She prepared a celebratory dinner, lighting candles and setting the table with their best china. But when Jonathan walked through the door, his demeanor was distant, his excuses for being late rehearsed. Sophia decided to wait for a better moment, unaware that Jonathan's thoughts were consumed by someone else entirely. Meanwhile, Lillian was unraveling. The reality of her pregnancy was impossible to ignore, and the implications were devastating. She sat alone in her small apartment on the outskirts of Willowbrook, staring at the sonogram photo she had taken earlier that day. The child growing inside her was almost certainly Jonathan's, a man who was still very much tied to his wife. The next night, unable to bear the weight of her secret any longer, Lillian called Jonathan. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Tonight." They met at Birchwood Park, a place far from prying eyes. The park was deserted, its paths slick with frost and bathed in the dim glow of street lamps. Jonathan arrived with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold night air. Lillian was already there, pacing near a bench, her arms crossed tightly against the chill. "What's wrong?" Jonathan asked, his voice low. Lillian turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm pregnant," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "And I think it's yours." Jonathan staggered back slightly, the weight of her confession hitting him like a tidal wave. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his mind racing. Lillian, are you sure? She nodded, tears threatening to spill. I've taken every test. I don't know what to do, Jonathan. I can't go through this alone. Jonathan's thoughts spiraled. Just hours earlier, Sophia had hinted at planning something special, her smile holding a brightness he hadn't seen in months. Now, this revelation threatened to unravel everything. We need time to think, he stammered. To figure out what to do. But before they could say more, the crunch of footsteps on the frozen path startled them. Unbeknownst to them, Sophia had followed Jonathan, her suspicions finally pushing her to act. She stopped a few feet away, hidden in the shadows of a cluster of birch trees, her heart pounding as she overheard their conversation. Sophia's world shattered in an instant. Pregnant. Lillian was pregnant, and Jonathan was the father. Her perfect life, her carefully crafted marriage, crumbled before her eyes. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, stifling a sob as her other hand instinctively rested on her own stomach. She didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, she turned and walked away, the icy wind biting at her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her mind raced as she replayed every moment, every clue she had ignored. The late nights, the evasive answers, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume. It had all been right in front of her, and she had been too blind to see. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Sophia felt her grief transform into something colder, harder. Betrayal coursed through her veins, but so did resolve. She would not let Jonathan and Lillian destroy her life without consequences. And in the quiet, frozen stillness of her bedroom, Sophia began to plan. Sophia Harper wasn't one to act impulsively. For all the turmoil raging inside her, she knew she needed a clear head and a plan. That night, after overhearing Jonathan and Lillian in Birchwood Park, Sophia lay awake, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling of their bedroom. The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't just the affair. It was the audacity of it all, the lies, the deceit, and now, the child growing inside another woman. Sophia's hand instinctively rested on her own stomach as she whispered to herself, "He won't get away with this." The next morning, Sophia went about her day as if nothing had changed. She kissed Jonathan on the cheek as he left for work, her smile serene. But beneath her composed exterior, she was already putting her plan into motion. Sophia's first step was to confirm what she already knew. She began by checking Jonathan's phone whenever he left it unattended. His texts with Lillian were sparse and cryptic, short exchanges that hinted at secret meetings without saying much outright. It was enough to make her blood boil but not enough to use as proof. Next, she went through his credit card statements. She found charges for dinners at restaurants she'd never been to and hotel stays in towns nearby. One receipt from a quaint inn just outside Willowbrook made her pause. It was dated a week before, on a night Jonathan had claimed to be working late at the hospital. She printed it out, her hands shaking as she placed it in a growing folder of evidence. Sophia also began paying closer attention to Jonathan's routines. When he said he was attending a meeting or staying late at work, she made note of the times and places. On more than one occasion, she drove past the hospital parking lot to confirm whether his car was there. More often than not, it wasn't. Her suspicions were no longer just suspicions. They were cold, hard facts. A week later, after dinner, Sophia decided it was time. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. Jonathan sat in his usual chair, flipping through a medical journal, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sophia stood in the doorway, clutching the folder of evidence, her heart pounding. "Jonathan," she said, her voice steadied despite the storm inside her. "We need to talk." Jonathan looked up, his expression softening. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Sophia walked to the dining table, setting the folder down with a deliberate thud. "I know about you and Lillian. The words hung in the air like a sharp blade. Jonathan's face paled, his hands frozen mid-page turn. "Sophia," he began, his voice weak, "I can explain." "Don't," she interrupted, her tone icy. "Don't insult me with lies. I know everything, the affair, the pregnancy, the nights you spent with her while I sat here, waiting for you." Jonathan's mouth opened, but no words came. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his secrets finally breaking him. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. I love you, Sophia. I swear I do." "Love?" Sophia's voice rose, her composure cracking. "You call this love? Sneaking around with another woman while your pregnant wife, waits at home for you? You've destroyed everything, Jonathan. Everything." Tears streamed down Jonathan's face as he reached for her, but Sophia stepped back, her green eyes blazing. "Don't you dare touch me," she spat. "I want you out of this house. Tonight." "Sophia, please," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "Let's talk about this. We can fix it." "There's nothing left to fix," she said coldly. "And don't even think about running to her. If you do, I swear I'll make sure everyone in Willowbrook knows the truth. Your career, your reputation, it'll all be gone." Jonathan sat frozen, his hands trembling in his lap. Finally, he nodded. "I'll pack my things." Sophia watched as he gathered a small suitcase, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When he turned back to face her, his eyes were filled with desperation. "Sophia," he whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything." "Sorry doesn't change what you've done," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "Just go." Jonathan left that night, his car disappearing down the darkened street. Sophia stood by the window, her reflection a ghostly silhouette against the glass. She felt hollow, her anger now replaced by an aching emptiness. Word of Jonathan's absence quickly spread through Willowbrook. Neighbors whispered about the sudden change, though Sophia maintained her usual poise, refusing to discuss the matter with anyone. When people asked where Jonathan was, she smiled faintly and said, "He's staying at the inn for work." Meanwhile, Jonathan checked into the Pinewood Inn, a modest motel on the outskirts of town. He spent his days at the hospital, avoiding Lillian's gaze, and his nights alone, consumed by regret. Sophia, however, was not done. In her quiet, calculated way, she continued to plan her next steps. She wasn't just seeking revenge, she was reclaiming her life. And in the small, watchful town of Willowbrook, she knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in Jonathan's carefully curated image became impossible to ignore. January draped Willowbrook in a somber gray, the once bright holiday lights now replaced with the dull, colorless skies of winter. Life in the small town trudged on, but for Jonathan Harper, the world had grown unbearably small. From his cramped room at the Pinewood Inn, he stared out at the icy road, his thoughts a tangled mess of regret and despair. Every day felt heavier than the last. He had lost everything, his home, his wife, and the life he had worked so tirelessly to maintain. The whispers in the hospital hallways followed him like shadows. Though no one dared to confront him directly, Jonathan could feel the weight of their judgment. Even Lillian Chong, the woman who had once been his solace, had grown distant. Their conversations, once filled with warmth and connection, had turned terse and strained. She, too, was drowning in the consequences of their choices. That night, after another fruitless attempt to reconcile with Sophia, Jonathan sat alone at the small desk in his motel room. A blank sheet of paper lay before him, and for a long time, he simply stared at it. Finally, with trembling hands, he began to write. He wrote 3 letters, one to Sophia, one to Lillian, and one to his unborn child. Each was filled with raw, unfiltered emotion, apologies, regrets, and desperate wishes for forgiveness. As he sealed the last envelope, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't bear the wait any longer. Jonathan drove to Seaview Cliff, a secluded spot overlooking the freezing waters of the Atlantic. The cliffs were a well-known destination for those seeking solace or reflection, but under the cloak of darkness, they became a place of eerie stillness. The sound of waves crashing against the jagged rocks below echoed through the cold night air as Jonathan parked his car at the edge. He stepped out, clutching the letters tightly. The frigid wind bit at his face as he walked to the edge, his breath visible in the moonlight. For a moment, he simply stood there, the vast expanse of water before him mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. As he prepared to sit down, headlights pierced the darkness. Another car pulled up, its engine cutting off abruptly. Jonathan turned, startled, as a familiar figure stepped out. It was Daniel Chong, Lillian's estranged ex-husband. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" Jonathan called out, his voice strained. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he approached with deliberate steps, his face shadowed but his intentions unmistakable. In his hand was a small black case, its contents concealed, but ominous. "Do you know what you've done?" Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and venomous. "You've destroyed everything. You've ruined Lillian's life. You've ruined mine." Jonathan's heart pounded as he took a step back, the edge of the cliff just a few feet behind him. "Daniel, I don't know what you think this is, but—" "I think," Daniel interrupted, pulling a small vial and syringe from the case, "that you need to pay for what you've done." Jonathan froze, his mind racing. "This isn't the way, Daniel. Whatever anger you have, it's me, not her. Leave her out of this." But Daniel's mind was made up. His movements were steady, calculated, and unyielding. He held the syringe up, the clear liquid glinting in the moonlight. "You're right. It is you. And you'll pay tonight." What happened next was a blur of desperation and terror. Jonathan tried to resist, but Daniel's grip was firm. A scuffle ensued, the sound of their struggle swallowed by the wind and waves. In the chaos, Daniel injected the contents of the syringe into Jonathan's arm, a lethal cocktail designed to mimic a drug overdose. Jonathan collapsed to the ground, his breath shallow as his vision blurred. Daniel crouched beside him, his voice cold and detached. "Don't worry, Jonathan. I'll make sure it looks like you did this to yourself." With methodical precision, Daniel arranged Jonathan's body near the cliff's edge, leaving the 3 letters on the driver's seat of his car. He adjusted the scene to look like a man consumed by guilt, seeking a tragic end. When he was satisfied, Daniel stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth before tossing it into the ocean. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Tyler McCoy, a teenage aspiring filmmaker, arrived at the cliff to capture footage of the sunrise for a school project. He noticed Jonathan's car parked near the edge and began filming. Through his camera lens, Tyler caught a fleeting image of Daniel's car driving away, a crucial piece of evidence he wouldn't realize he held until days later. Later that morning, Jonathan's body was found by a jogger who called the authorities. News of his death spread through Willowbrook like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the town. At first, everyone assumed it was suicide. The letters seemed to confirm it, a man overwhelmed by guilt, choosing to end his pain. Sophia, upon hearing the news, collapsed in grief. Despite her anger, she had never truly stopped loving him. The thought that her harsh words might have driven him to this broke her in ways she couldn't explain. Lillian, too, was devastated. Consumed by guilt and fear, she was hospitalized for complications related to her pregnancy. For a time, the town mourned the tragic end of a man who had once been a pillar of the community. But in the quiet aftermath, one person wasn't convinced. Detective Laura Mitchell, assigned to investigate the case, noticed details that didn't add up. The scene felt too clean, too staged. Why had Jonathan left the driver's door open in freezing weather? And why were there faint drag marks in the dirt leading away from the car? The breakthrough came when Tyler McCoy reviewed his footage and noticed the shadowy figure of Daniel's car. He brought the video to the police, and for the first time, the narrative of Jonathan's suicide began to unravel. In Willowbrook, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. And the truth about Jonathan Harper's death was only just beginning to surface. As winter's icy grip tightened over Willowbrook, the small town buzzed with whispers of Jonathan Harper's untimely death. The initial shock of his apparent suicide began to fade, replaced by quiet speculation. For many, it seemed a tragic but straightforward end to a life consumed by guilt. But for Detective Laura Mitchell, the case refused to sit neatly in its box. Something about the scene at Seaview Cliff gnawed at her, a feeling that the pieces didn't quite fit. Laura was a seasoned investigator, known for her tenacity and sharp instincts. From the moment she arrived at the cliff, she had noticed small inconsistencies. The car, parked perfectly parallel to the edge, seemed oddly deliberate for a man supposedly overcome with despair. The faint drag marks in the dirt, the lack of footprints leading away, and the meticulous placement of the letters all suggested staging. And then there was the autopsy report, a lethal cocktail of drugs in Jonathan's system, injected rather than ingested. It was too precise, too calculated for a spur-of-the-moment decision. Laura began by revisiting the people closest to Jonathan. She interviewed Sophia Harper in the somber quiet of her home. Sophia, visibly shaken and pale, recounted their final argument, tears streaming as she confessed her regrets. "I told him to leave," she whispered, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "I was so angry. But I never thought he'd do this." "Did he say anything unusual before he left that night?" Laura pressed gently. Sophia shook her head. "He said he wanted to fix things, to make it right. But I wouldn't let him." Laura noted the detail. Jonathan had been intent on resolution, not despair. It was a thread she couldn't ignore. Her next visit was to Lillian Chong, who had been hospitalized due to complications with her pregnancy. Lillian, a shadow of her usual composed self, was hesitant but cooperative. She admitted to the affair and revealed Jonathan's growing stress in the weeks leading up to his death. "When was the last time you spoke to him?" Laura asked, her tone probing but calm. "The night before Lillian paused, her voice trembling. "He called me. He sounded frantic, said he had a plan to fix everything. But I told him I needed time to think. I didn't see him after that." Laura's instincts flared. Jonathan had spoken to both women about making amends, yet the narrative of his suicide painted a man consumed by guilt. The pieces didn't align. The case took a dramatic turn when Tyler McCoy, the teenage filmmaker, walked into the police station. Nervous but determined, Tyler presented the footage he had captured at Seaview Cliff the morning of Jonathan's death. The grainy video showed Jonathan's car parked at the edge, but also captured the faint headlights of another vehicle pulling away in the distance. "Do you recognize the car?" Laura asked, her heart pounding. Tyler nodded. "It's a black sedan. I've seen it before in town." Laura's team traced the vehicle to Daniel Chong, Lillian's estranged ex-husband. Her suspicions sharpened as she dug into Daniel's past, a history of emotional manipulation and control over Lillian. Records revealed a series of threatening messages he had sent her months before she moved to Willowbrook. One, in particular, chilled Laura. "You think you can escape me? Watch what happens if you try." Confronting Daniel became the next critical step. Daniel was brought in for questioning. At first, he played the part of the calm, concerned ex-husband. But as Laura laid out the evidence, his car at the cliff, the autopsy report, and the threatening messages, his facade began to crack. "I didn't mean to kill him," Daniel finally spat, his composure shattering. "But he ruined everything. He destroyed my family." Laura pressed further, her voice unwavering. "What happened that night, Daniel? With gritted teeth, Daniel recounted the confrontation. He had followed Jonathan to the cliff, enraged by the affair and the pregnancy. "I gave him a choice," Daniel sneered. "Take the injection, or I'd expose everything, him, Lillian, all of it." He thought he was protecting them by going quietly. "Why stage it as a suicide?" Laura asked, her tone cutting through his rationalizations. "To make him the villain," Daniel admitted. "To make them both pay." Daniel's confession sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. The once quiet accountant was revealed as a calculating manipulator, driven by jealousy and control. He was charged with second-degree murder and faced a 25-year sentence. For Sophia, the revelation was bittersweet. The truth cleared Jonathan's name, but it couldn't erase the pain of his betrayal, or bring him back. She found herself grappling with a complex mix of grief, anger, and an ache for what could never be repaired. Lillian, too, was deeply affected. The man who had haunted her life was finally behind bars, but the cost had been unimaginable. She decided it was time to leave Willowbrook, seeking a fresh start far from the memories that bound her to the town. In the weeks that followed, Willowbrook struggled to come to terms with the tragedy. For Detective Laura Mitchell, the case was a sobering reminder of how far secrets and lies could spiral. But as she filed away the last report, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Justice had been served, and the truth, no matter how painful, had come to light. For Sophia and Lillian, the road ahead was uncertain. Yet, in their own ways, both women resolved to move forward, determined to find hope amidst the ruins. And in the quiet corners of Willowbrook, the story of Jonathan Harper's death, and the dark web of betrayal that surrounded it, became a cautionary tale whispered among its residents, a reminder of how easily darkness could creep into even the most perfect-seeming lives. Months passed, and the biting chill of winter gave way to the gentle warmth of spring in Willowbrook. The once idyllic town, shaken by the scandal and tragedy of Jonathan Harper's death, slowly returned to its rhythms. Yet, for those closest to the events, life would never quite be the same. For Sophia, the house on Elm Street became both a sanctuary and a prison. Every corner held memories of Jonathan, his laughter at the dinner table, the sound of his keys jingling as he walked through the front door. Yet, despite the pain, Sophia refused to leave. She was determined to reclaim the space, to transform it into a home filled with new beginnings rather than old wounds. In late June, Sophia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Holding her son in her arms for the first time, she felt a rush of emotions she couldn't name. The grief for what Jonathan had done, the love she still carried for him, and the hope that this child could symbolize something better. She named him Jacob Harper, a tribute to the man Jonathan had once been, the man she had loved before secrets and lies tore them apart. Sophia chose to stay in Willowbrook, though she took an extended leave from teaching to focus on healing. In the quiet moments of motherhood, she found a measure of peace. Her days were filled with Jacob's coos and cries, and for the first time in months, her laughter returned. Though she would always carry the scars of betrayal, Sophia vowed to raise her son with strength and compassion, teaching him the value of honesty and integrity. After the trial, Lillian Chung knew she couldn't stay in Willowbrook. The town's whispers, the pitying glances from former patients, and the haunting memories of Daniel's actions left her feeling trapped. With her baby girl due any day, she packed her belongings and moved west to Eugene, Oregon, a town known for its lush greenery and slower pace of life. In Eugene, Lillian found solace in anonymity. She gave birth to a beautiful daughter, Lila Chong, and dedicated herself to rebuilding her life. She reopened a small gynecology practice, but this time with a focus on helping women who had suffered trauma. Her work became her redemption, a way to channel her pain into something meaningful. Though she rarely spoke of Jonathan or Daniel, she carried their impact with her. In quiet moments, she would look at Lila and wonder what her daughter might one day ask about her father. When the time came, Lillian decided she would tell her the truth, but only the parts that mattered. That he had loved her, in his own flawed way, and that his mistakes didn't define the man he had been. For the residents of Willowbrook, the Harper Chong scandal became a cautionary tale whispered about at church socials and over coffee at the local diner. The town, once a symbol of perfection, now served as a reminder of how easily secrets could fester beneath a polished surface. Detective Laura Mitchell, having closed one of the most complex cases of her career, turned her attention back to the quiet work of small-town policing. Yet, the lessons from the Harper case stayed with her. She often thought of Sophia and Lillian, two women who had been broken by the same man but found strength in different ways. As the seasons turned, both Sophia and Lillian began to heal. Though their paths diverged, they carried with them a shared understanding of loss and resilience. Life had dealt them painful blows, but they refused to be defined by the actions of others. Instead, they chose to move forward, not forgetting the past but allowing it to shape them into something stronger. In the end, the story of Jonathan Harper, Lillian Chong, and the tragedy that bound them together became more than just a tale of betrayal and loss. It was a story of survival, of the power of truth, and the unyielding will to rebuild after everything falls apart. What do you think about this story of betrayal, tragedy, and redemption? Do you sympathize more with Sophia, Lillian, or even Jonathan? Why? How would you have handled the situation if you were in Sophia's shoes? Backhand index pointing right. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Backhand index pointing right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.